Good morning, and welcome to today's live event, Levers and Drivers for the Four Pillars of Self-Mastery. Today, I'm going to talk about something that impacts performance, leadership, and decision-making more than most people realize. The pace of change is accelerating, and the volume of disruption, bad news, conflict, uncertainty, pressure feels like it's flooding the zone, literally. And here's the problem. Most people are trying to manage that after the fact with kind of regulation. They wait until they feel overwhelmed. Then they try to calm down. They wait until the stress is already in their body. Then they try to think clearly. But when the stimulus is coming this fast, the conscious mind can't keep up. You don't have enough time or enough bandwidth to analyze every trigger, process every emotion, and talk yourself down 50 times a day. So the strategy has to evolve. What we need is prevention, the ability to catch it early and stop the cascade before it becomes fight or flight, before it becomes panic, before it turns into hours of internal catastrophizing. Because once the nervous system shifts into threat monitoring mode, the danger isn't just what's happening outside, it's what your mind starts generating inside, replaying, predicting, scanning, rehearsing worst case scenarios until your system recruits more and more anxiety pathways and you end up escalating yourself from the inside. That's what destroys agency. So today is not about insight. It's not about intellectual understanding. It's about training. I'm going to introduce two practical tools: positivity conditioning, which shifts your bias, the default bias, from expecting threats to expecting neutral outcomes and even positive outcomes. And I'll also introduce emotional modulation, an approach that happens so early in the sequence that the emotion doesn't get a chance to lodge and take over. This is about building automaticity, because in real life, you don't rise to the level of your intentions, you fall to the level of your conditioning. So today, we're going to practice the levers that return you to presence, keep you in regulation, and keep you in focus and engagement rather than fight or flight. So focus and engage is what we want. That's where agency comes from. Focus and engage, no matter what's happening around you. So let's jump in. I'll start with just a quick illustration to get us all on the same page, because I talk about the 7-step quite a bit, and I talk about, hold on a second, see that. I talk about the 7-step reset, and next week I'll get into steps 4 through 6, which I tend to not talk about a lot. But when I mention agency, when I mention presence, mindfulness, these things, we're talking about steps 1, 2, and 7. So 7 is our return to presence. Because if you think about steps 1 through 7 as something we repeat over and over as part of the series of stimulus response cycles, I should say stimulus response cycles, because we go from reaction and then to response, right? Presence is at the end, so we return to presence. This is happening thousands of times a day. If we don't return to presence, we're bringing our old stress, our past concerns and anxieties into the next stimulus response cycle, which turns it into a stimulus reaction cycle because it starts going so fast and we're kind of triggering ourselves from the inside. This is our conditioning. So we're constantly working on our conditioning, and we'll do some of this today. As I said, we don't rise to the level of our attentions, we fall to the level of our conditioning. And then this one is regulation, or regulated. You want to get back to being regulated. And by being regulated, you're now ready for that stimulus. Regulation has is a broad term. It has corrective after the fact, and it has prevention before the fact. So we want to work on both of those, and that's why we want to that's why we get regulated before the stimulus, because if we can be regulated, then we're not dealing with the anxiety that comes from whatever stimulus shows up. And then we have this early stage, early detection, and that's what we'll be talking about today. To look at this another way, if we have the conditioning over here, and in that conditioning we have our beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and physiology. And then we have this step, so this is step one, and then we have this step two, and our stimulus is over here. And what we're creating is a longer time, a longer duration of regulation, of being regulated. Most people have understood that meditation has something to do with this. And there's two ways first of all, I like what Emily Fletcher says about meditation. We don't meditate to get good at meditation. We meditate to get good at life. But by meditating, we're extending the time. So let's say you meditate for 45 minutes. That's 45 minutes of your waking hour that you're not unregulated. So the more time we spend in a regulated state, the less stimuli we're going to encounter. And if you just think about ratios, the fewer stimuli we have, the fewer fight or flight episodes we're going to have. So the more you meditate, the less you're going into those stress patterns. To me, that's not the sole purpose of meditation. What I want to do with meditating is I want to get to the point where I can stay in this regulated state for the entire day. And what I've landed on is just a 10-minute in the morning to get myself reset every morning, because you wake up, you're fresh, right? So you hydrate and all that, and I regulate in the morning. But here's the idea in the 7-step reset. If we start catastrophizing, just fixed it. If we start catastrophizing, what's going to happen is you start looking internally, the system starts looking internally for more justification to be stressed, and it finds more stress. So we talk about, relaxing the fist, unclenching the jaw, relaxing your shoulders, maybe leaning back if you're sitting down, because what we need to do is get out of that stress posture, because the stress posture just reinforces this catastrophization. The system is looking for reasons to be stressed out. It's going to find them, and anything will do. And then you start thinking about all the things that could go wrong. So by extending the time that we're regulated, it's easier to get back to a regulated state. Now, this takes a while. If you're meditating, you start meditating, you may not notice the effects of this, the elongation, for weeks, maybe even a couple of months. But once you understand that one of the things you're doing with meditating is extending this regulated time, the other thing you can do is get yourself involved in activities where you are spending more time being regulated. So, for example, hiking. I love riding the motorcycle in the twisties, because you're constantly focused. You're 2-lane road. You got a lot of blind turns. You're at a spirited pace. You're constantly looking. I had a buddy whose wife suggested that he take his blood pressure before a ride, go out, do a twisties ride, a couple of hours, and come back. Blood pressure was way back, was to normal, and he had been struggling with it. That is a illustration as to how this being regulated can get us out of that fight or flight. We're just reducing the amount of times we're in fight or flight, and eventually we start building positivity and we start building the the more of a presence. It's easier to get into presence. And I'll talk a little bit today about some things we can do to get there quickly. I'll set it up with that, but then we're going to get to the two conditioning ones. And I want to focus on the conditioning because that's what's going to make it work on a bad day of a bad week. That's where the automaticity comes from when you build it in the conditioning, because if you've watched any of this content, you know how fast the subconscious or network of neurons processes, and the conscious mind is just slow compared to it. I mean, it's 50 bits per second versus 11 million bits per second. It's not even in the ballpark. So what we have to do is condition these things in at the network of neurons level so it's happening automatically real time, in a prevention posture rather than a reactive one. All right, so that's sort of a setup just to kind of get ourselves on the same page when I start talking about that step two, because what I'll say is that as we want to avoid if we feel like a spiral is coming on, rather than, you don't want to suppress it because that'll just accelerate it. But rather than try to stop it, what we're going to do is interrupt it by stretching out what comes before. So if you accept the fact that when we're catastrophizing, there's no more tigers coming, proverbial tigers. There was one proverbial tiger. That was the threat. After that proverbial tiger, the rest of the threats we were manufacturing inside, because the system is looking for more justification as to why we're so stressed out, and it's going to find things. And if it can't find them, it just keeps recruiting neurons. And it doesn't know that this neuron you recruited or neural pathway has to do with something that happened 5 or 10, 15 years ago. It's just looking for anything that's worthy of this much stress. And that's how you see a person spiral up. And the other thing that can happen is it kicks in the I don't want power. And now we're fighting against ourselves. And that I don't want power can also be associated with fight or flight or existential. And now you have this piling on, which is why sometimes it's just hard to get out of it. And if you ever work with somebody and you see that they get through it, once they take the action and they get through it, then they're calm. It's like, okay, now it flips. Now they're like, okay, what can I do? Now they want to be successful. I used to do an exercise where I would have people imagine that they were in this field, and they would walk across, they'd have to start walking across this field, and there was this huge ball that was way off in the distance. And as they got closer to it, it turned into this gyrating thing with fumes coming off of it. You could see the heat waves coming off of it, and it was moving, and it was these gross colors. Basically, I'm trying to depict something that looks like a monster, right? But I call it a ball. And they get closer, it gets bigger, and they can smell it, and it's scary, and it's gyrating, and it's taunting them. And what I'm doing is, in the workshop, I'm looking to make sure that people are starting to get tense because they're getting closer to it. So I'm creating a set of associations. The reason I don't do it in the workshops anymore is because I have to get people into a semi-hypnotic state. And it's hard to keep everybody there. And you're going to have people who don't fall into that state. And so it doesn't, if you're not fully into that state, you may not experience. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Anyway, as you get closer and I'm watching the tension, then I have the person slowly reach out and touch it. And you could see that and I have them physically do it. And then you could see that it's getting tense. And then they touch it. And then you see this relief happen because it disappears. You could do it yourself. You touch this thing, and it's sort of like a metaphor for you face your fears, and the death of the fears are certain. And it's very similar to this thing that when we're catastrophizing, we're just reacting to internal fear, internal associations. So some of this will be review if you've been watching some of the live. So I go live every day, and Monday through Thursday, I'm on my Facebook and YouTube channels. And then on Friday, I add LinkedIn and in a way recap the week. So if you've seen any of the other content, if you go out to 7stepreset.com/live, you'll be able to see some of those earlier videos, or you just go out to the platform. That's where they stay, because on that website, I only show yesterday's video and then the one that's coming. So this is the 4 pillars of self-mastery. And this is aligned and supportive of emotional intelligence, not taking anything away from emotional intelligence, but emotional intelligence was created and developed in the mid 90s. And at that time, the neuroscience that was out to the public wasn't far enough along. They were still deep in the labs trying to figure this thing out. Myelin, for example, was very much being understood. I think it was thought of as an inert gas until as late as the 1950s. By the late 90s, they realized that myelin had to do with more efficient, effective, and faster firing neurons, which is where habits live. So up until that clarity around the neurons, it was easy to think of habits living in the subconscious mind. But this is why I call it a network of neurons. The habits live in the network of neurons, and the conscious mind is the conscious mind. So when you have these habits, it's not you, it's not you. And when you do this catastrophizing, it's not you, it's not your mind, it's your network of neurons. So it's important to have that separation. Self-awareness and self-management are 2 of the 4 pillars of emotional intelligence. What I'm talking about today gets directly at self-awareness and self-management, and that's the self-mastery. So the self-mastery takes in both of those 2 bullets, and it's foundational for dynamic leadership. So there are some parallels and overlap. Here are the 4 pillars. Knowledge, habit, mastery is second, because you have to first get to the point that you believe you can change your habits for the rest of this to even be interesting. And then state mastery is about what I was just talking about, getting back to presence so that we're ready for that next stimulus. So we're not going into stress mode all the time, but we're staying calm and adaptive and ready. And then you have your forgiveness. And I put that in there because as we go through the 7 performance areas, the mental, physical, spiritual is definitely in our control. And that's spiritual, our higher self, not the spiritual realm, our awareness of awareness. And then the emotional is in our control as well. But if a person is spending a lot of time being stressed out, then they are probably emotionally hijacked and they feel like something's taking over. So we move from 100% control here to 100% control here. And that's where the emotional modulation comes in. That's what we'll be doing today. And then the relationship, professional, financial, these all require other people. And the reason why I put forgiveness in there is because if a person gets agency here, but they have some open wounds from past relationships that they haven't healed or worked through a process, and they have something that reminds them, maybe a song comes on, or maybe a place is mentioned, and that has to do with where they had this hurt and pain. And next thing you know, internally, they're going into this fight or flight and this anxiety and all this tension comes up. And then back to the point, once this tension comes up, it goes both ways. Shallow breathing creates anxiety. Anxiety creates shallow breathing. You start breathing shallow, the system, that early detection system, is going to be looking around. Okay, something's causing stress. What is it? It's going to find stuff and pull it in. Next thing you know, you're checked out because you're focused on this thing that happened 5 years ago. So that's why I put forgiveness in there as one of the pillars to make sure that we've closed those or healed those open wounds. Then professional and financial. Those are usually out of scope because that has to do with the person's quest, and whatever the quest is, we do the work there. Usually we'll uncover some more challenges, create some bad days out of the bad week, not intentionally, but when you're stretching, that's going to happen. And that gives us another chance to get stronger with the agency. Mental is the foundation. You have to have the knowledge, but to know or not do is to not know. So we spend a lot of time in the actual habit change, and that's why neuroplasticity is so important. So while the second one is physical, most of it is dealing with physiology, and neuroplasticity lives in the network of neurons, and that's why it sits in the physiology. Consciousness, awareness of awareness, that's your spiritual, and then self-regulation would be the emotion. And what we focus on here is prevention and early addressing it, so we're not into suppressing or trying to get back on track. And then there's your 7-step reset. So step 1 is your conditioning. Step 2 is where we're regulated. This is the picture I was drawing, right? Having that getting this longer and longer. The more time I spend in step 2 in a day, the fewer stimulus reactions I'm going to have. I drew a diagram the other day where if you focus on your purpose, you start with purpose, and you have somewhere, let's call it about 120 degrees from that purpose is your range of what you're going to be paying attention to. The rest of that you can ignore for the most part. You can check in on it once a week, but I'm not going to react to every little thing if it's outside of my cone of purpose and passion, of my direction. So that's going to reduce the number of stimulus response cycles you have. That's going to reduce the potential for threat. But the other thing we're going to do in this step, we're going to condition the positivity. We're going to do the positivity conditioning. So your early detection in here and your rapid appraisal before the conscious mind even comes online, even before the subconscious reaction time happens. Remember, subconscious or network of neuron reaction time happens in about a quarter of a second. But that quarter of a second, stuff is going on. Where there's initial detection, there's already pre-listening or prediction of what's going on. There's some early listening and so, some early detection, and then there's some rapid appraisal. That's happening before the quote unquote reaction time, and that influences what the reaction will be. That's where we put in the automaticity. That's where we put in these shifts for habits, because if you wait until the reaction is happening, it's already too late, because the early part of that step 3 is already decided. Step 4 is your response, and I say don't let your response equal your reaction. The reaction is coming from the network of neurons, which typically is from the past, and it's typically what worked before. So if you're doing something new, and because things is changing so much, typically by next year, what worked in the past is not going to work in the present. And that's already the case. I'm being generous by saying next year. And there are things we can do here. We can actually create some automaticity in step 3, the conditioning, so that not only does it hand off a recommended approach to the conscious mind for the response, but we can actually have it do something like and this is what I'll talk about next week. We can actually have it set up, for example, the first 5 steps of problem solving. So you clearly define the problem, you look at possible solutions. So it's giving you a recommendation. It can do that because it processes at 11 million bits per second. So why not have it hand off something that's useful instead of just recruiting random neurons that the subconscious thinks? That's the reticular activating system that does that. And you know how the reticular activating system works. You've all experienced it. If you set a goal, for some people, they immediately start getting some serendipity. Other people immediately start getting obstacles. That's the reticular activating system filtering from the network of neurons to the conscious mind based on what your makeup. Another example most people have experienced, they throw something away, and then within a couple of days, they find they have a need for it. It's not like the need popped up. It's that the reticular activating system, you primed it by not wanting to throw it away because you might need it. So the reticular activating system follows the instruction and it looks for some reason to have it. And then that reinforces not throwing stuff away. Once you recognize it for what it is, you just throw stuff away. You just move on. You don't need the baggage. Step 5 is emotional modulation. And we're going to talk about that today because we use a emotional modulation generically to stay in step 2 when we need it. But we also use a emotional modulation based on the current stimulus response cycle. So we don't always need it, but if something hits and you start getting triggered, that's the time that we're going to use the emotional modulation before step 6, which is action. We don't want to be taking action when we're emotionally triggered. The good news is this can be done in a second or 2. Once you have practice, it happens automatically. Just the thought can make it happen. But initially, like today, when we do the exercise, it's a good 90 seconds. And then we have step 6, which is action. And there I talk about we're going to do it, we're going to delay it, we're going to delegate it, or we're going to discard it. It's some form of that. And that all comes from here as part of your response. And if you're in the moment with somebody and you're feeling this, that you've got to do some modulation, you may say, give me a minute. Why don't we get together in about 15 minutes? I just want to look at something, or I've got something I need to take care of, whatever. You can put that pause in there. That would be delaying it, for example. And then we're going to turn to mindfulness or presence. That's step 7, is getting back to presence. So the idea here is that 7, 1, and 2 are the important ones. 7, 1, and 2 is where we maintain our agency and personal leadership. 7, 1, and 2. Back to presence. Keep working on our conditioning. That's our baseline. And then making sure we're regulated so we're using the most amount of our conditioning capability as possible. This is what I was talking about, the early detection. So this pre-listening, the brain is always predicting. It processes so fast. You walk into a room, it's always predicting what kind of things might I encounter. Most doctors will tell you that when people are in the doctor's office, their blood pressure tends to be higher as a whole. The blood pressure tends to elevate. And you may not feel stress at all, but your blood pressure's up. And this is, I would say, this pre-listening that's happening. You're in a doctor's office. Very seldom do you get fantastic news when you're at the doctor's, because that's why you're at the doctor. Even the physical, though, you don't want bad news. So you're getting this pre-listening, and it's probably spiking your blood pressure, is what I'm guessing. Here's the initial detection. This is where the positivity, and here, these two, this is where the positivity lives. And this is inside that quarter of a second. This is what I was talking about. The reaction time of the subconscious, when you look that up, it says it's a quarter of a second. But there's work going on here. Cognitive biases are happening. Meta programs are happening in here. Path of least resistance is happening in here because it's forming the reaction. So if you watch a cat that has a reaction time of anywhere from 40 to 80 milliseconds, and you've seen these things where they use a snake or a cucumber or a tin aluminum foil or whatever, the cat jumps. That 40 to 80 milliseconds was what was going on here. The initial detection, the rapid appraisal, and then the jump. The jump is the reaction formation or the reaction. And then we got into the conscious mind side. And this is the 712 depiction, 712, 712, because if we don't do that, we run the risk of doing this. And this is depicting how we're reacting or responding to our own conditioning. And then we're bringing in our own stimulus. And this is where the catastrophization comes in, because you're not getting reset. You're not getting back to presence. You're leaving the reaction, and you're not even getting the conscious mind involved. And, you might hear a person, oh, but this is going to happen and that's going to happen. They're just saying stuff. They're just making stuff up because they're so stressed out. But meanwhile, the subconscious is just taking off and running. This is what it looks like when somebody's being triggered. You look at those videos of someone being triggered. This is what's going on. It's not rational. And you may hear people talking to them. That's why you'll see, if it's a law enforcement situation, the other person just walk over and do it. They take the gun out of their hand, or they move them away, because rational speaking is not going to work here, because the subconscious or network of neurons is fully in charge. So we don't want this to happen, but you're not going to fix it here. You're going to fix it by leaning into step 1 and 2, which is why you want to practice meditation, because you want to be able to get back to that regulated state in a moment's notice. And here is, this slide depicts how, when I described what happens in muscle memory and physical skills, most people would agree. There's no pushback there. And that's what's depicting over here. Most people understand that it's neurons and elements that make up the movement. And so the movement is very easily seen as a habit, because if you want to work on muscles, you work over here. But when you come to identity and anxiety, very few people go over here and work on neurons and elements. They try to work on it here. You can't change your identity and your personality at the construct or summary level. You change it at the elements level, but people don't understand that, because it feels like it's too complex. It is complex, but it's made up of elements, and you can start ticking away at the elements. So that's an identity type habit pattern. You have the reactive type habit pattern. This is where somebody lashes out, or they say someone breaking a rule, and they feel like they have to engage and do something. This is like the Karen videos. Or maybe you have yourself, you may experience telling tension. When something happens, you have this telling tension. Or maybe if something goes wrong in a meeting, or somebody interrupts, or somebody asks a question, you may have a bad reaction because you're already threatened with that question that comes in, etc. Those are reactive habits. And then the behavioral habits are the ones that are more easily managed, the ones that people think of as habits. People tend not to think of this as being a habit pattern, because it's a construct, it's a summary. And it's important to see it that way. So when I work with a client, I want all of these bars out here. I want them seeing that they can change anything they want if they go to the elements. And then the way you change it to the element level is the same way you change You get muscle memory. You use deep practice. Now, I'm going to flip through these slides. So if you want to, you can just do screenshots. The first one, this one is just showing you some things you could do in the moment. So if you're getting triggered, what's happening is your attention is narrowing. You've come up with some meaning. You've narrowed your options. And this is like that red mist that happens that people talk about, like in a gunfight, for example. And then over here, you want to widen your perception, look for more options. I like the example of going to look out the window, going through a doorway. If you have that facility, if you're in a meeting, you can go look out the window. If you're just in a phone call, if you had a headset on, you could walk through a doorway and just allow that to process out. And these are some questions you can ask yourself. What outcome am I trying to protect right now? What would better look like in 10 minutes? These are questions you can ask as you do this to widen your perspective. And we have proven practices to return to present. A gulp of air and then a long exhale. And this activates the parasympathetic nervous system. This activates the ability to get back to focus and engage. So these are things you want to do them early. You can't wait. As soon as you feel that tension coming up, this is when you want to do this. They'll work later, but nowhere near as good. They work really well in the beginning because you stop the network of neurons from recruiting more neural pathways to justify more of that anxiety. Here's another one, the posture reset. You don't want to be in a stressed posture because that's just going to create more tension. As I said, it works both ways. Tight shoulders are caused by anxiety, but tight shoulders will also cause anxiety. Widen your vision. This is similar to what I talked about. Orient to the room. Just look around. Relax your eyes. Soft focus. Look behind the person. Look to their left and to the right. You don't necessarily have to look up to the ceiling, but it's more about pushing your vision, using more of your peripheral vision and noticing that. This is micro action to gain agency. Again, early on, that's what the 10 to 60 seconds is. You want to catch this early. Taking a sip of water, stand up, sit back. Remember, the subconscious is processing 11 million bits per second. The conscious mind is 50 bits. So even though it may only take a couple of seconds to take a sip of water, you've actually slowed down potentially 20 million bits of information from coming through because you've taken your attention off of that. And then this one is, again, just a summary. If you don't remember anything, release your jaw. Release your jaw, exhale fully, drop your shoulders, widen your gaze, and then take one step and reorient. All right, so this is what we're doing now. We're going to talk about emotional modulation first, and that's going to be sort of on this side, but we're also going to build it. So this is the network of neurons side. I already talked about this is where we're going to do the positivity training, and this is where we'll do some of the emotional modulation, but it's also over here because you're processing it with your conscious mind. In between here is the transition from the neural signal to perceived thought. For most people who are just going on about their life, especially in a flood the zone kind of environment, what's happening is there's no gap here. It goes straight from reaction formation, and sometimes it skips over the conscious engagement altogether and goes right to consolidation and action, and that becomes the response. We do not want the reaction to equal the response. This is where you get into having more problems than you tried to solve. Emotional modulation. Emotions are there to get your attention, so you want to learn from them. I don't want to think of emotions as good or bad. It's something to tell me. In hunter-gatherer, they tell us that the emotions are there pre-language. Before there was language, they could see if somebody bit into a piece of fruit or vegetable or whatever. Instantly, everyone in the tribe could see if there was a reaction on their face, right? So a lot of the communication before language happened just by looking at the person's face, and that's why the face is such a tell. There's like so many involuntary muscles in the face, and I understand also that the face is the only place in the human body where the muscles are attached directly to the skin. There is nothing in between. So we're going to process and learn from the emotion. Suppressed emotions become feelings, so you don't want to suppress them. And I think people get that. The more you suppress it, it builds and turns into a neurobiological event. Is now a neural pathway, but one of the things that people don't think about is when you suppress uncomfortable emotions, you're also suppressing the positive emotions like joy. So a person who's accustomed to suppressing their uncomfortable emotions, that according to this research, they'll experience less joy, less happiness, less fun because they suppress those emotions as well. Feelings can be recalled and enable anxiety. This is an important one. This is why we don't want the emotion to lodge. We want to process it and let it flow through. And then processed emotions allow a faster return to presence. And by doing this early with the emotional modulation, we go to presence within seconds. So basically, you have about 90 seconds to make this happen. And as I said, you'll get used to doing this and you can do it in a few seconds. So we want to surf the emotion, not suppress it. And these are the 8 uncomfortable emotions. This came from the book by Joan Rosenberg, 90 Seconds to a Life You Love. And she said these 8 emotions take in all of the emotions that are considered for anxiety. So in other words, by addressing these 8, you're actually addressing all the different kinds of anxiety that you feel. But what's nice about it, by labeling it, you're putting something concrete around this agency idea, anxiety idea. And if you just look at this list, if I'm feeling shame and that's what's causing me to feel anxious, there's a different strategy that I'm going to have than if I'm feeling frustration or disappointment. Now embarrassment and shame may be similar, sadness and disappointment may be similar, vulnerability and helplessness may be similar. But the point is, if by labeling it, you come up with a more realistic strategy for what to happen next. The reason we talk about surfing it is because if an emotion is coming on, you feel it start small and then it grows and it grows and it grows. And it feels like it's just going to keep growing. If you can just hang in there and allow it. So there's a RAIN model, recognize it, acknowledge it, investigate it to see what it's about, and then nurture. And that nurtures to get back to presence. But what we want to do is think of ourselves as surfing that emotion as it's rising up. We don't want to suppress it. Just let it rise, and then it's going to fall down the other side. If you put tension into it, if you put attention into it, you're going to create tension, and it will keep building. It's almost like wind and a kite. You take the wind away, the kite's going to fall. But as long as you're putting attention on it, that attention can act like the wind on a kite, and the emotion will keep going up, up, up. And next thing you know, it turns into a feeling. And now it's available for your network of neurons to trigger in to catastrophize in some later time. So what we want to do is locate the emotion, and you can do this right now. So what you'll do is, and by the way, whenever we do these exercises, always start small. And anytime you're learning something new, I recommend first start really small because you want to learn the steps. You want to learn the steps in a safe environment. You can't learn in fight or flight. The system, our system, is either biased towards growth or biased towards protection. And if you're biased towards protection, the growth is going to be limited. So we want to make sure that we're using easy things. So just some small emotion like you left your keys inside and had to go back in, or that you were late for an appointment by 2 or 3 minutes. Something small that you did have a little tinge of emotion. I want you to think about that. And now notice where it is in your body. This is the locator. You just feel where it is in your body. It might be in your shoulders, might be in your chest, might be in your stomach, whatever. And once you feel where it is, then label it. And you may feel like, well, I don't know. Well, if you did know, what would it be? Get yourself to pick one. And it could be 2 or 3, but for this exercise, just limit yourself to one, the one that's most likely it. Now that you have the one that's most likely it, you want to then say, okay, what is this emotion there to tell me? Why am I feeling this? And so in that example, if maybe you're late for a meeting or an appointment, what it's telling you is you have to use a different strategy to make sure that you're not late. Simple, right? But what was that emotion? Maybe that emotion felt a little shame, or maybe a little embarrassment, maybe a little disappointment in yourself, whatever it was. Then the question, after you've learned from it, you say, what do I have to do from here? And it may be nothing, but it may be something. But now you're back into your circle of influence. You're no longer looking at the circle of concern and not focusing on what you can do. This is just called emotional modulation. It's 90 seconds. Very simple. You locate it. And the reason to locate it is because you're slowing things down and you're focusing and you're taking your attention from out there to inside, but you're doing it in a focused way. So you're not just escalating. And then you label it with one of the uncomfortable emotions and then learn from it. What is this emotion there to teach me? And then what's not right yet, and what do I need to do from here would be your next steps. So again, you're acknowledging it. That's what's happening in the location stage. You're acknowledging it, and then by labeling it, you're reducing the emotion to just an element rather than a summary, and you're defining it. You're giving it some definition. And you want to be breathing when you do this, long, slow breaths. And this happens in seconds. Like I said, 90 seconds, but you'll get to the point where you do it in 3 or 4 seconds. I'm almost never using 90 seconds to do this. And it's because of the positivity exercise for one, but also because I've severely reduced the number of stimulus response cycles I have with some of these techniques and tactics that I'm talking about. And none of these are hacks. Hacks don't work because your brain is always trying to get back to efficiency, homeostasis. And so what it does is by getting back to homeostasis, it absorbs that hack and then it just neutralizes the hack. So, and then learn from it. So surfing the crest, and you're going to feel that emotion rise up. So even right now, you just feel that emotion rise up, and then you'll feel it go down on the other side. I also used to do this exercise where I would have people, I still do. So I would have people, the instruction works well in a workshop, put your 2 palms together like this, fingers pointing up. And on the count of 3, I want you to push as hard as you can with your right hand. 1, 2, 3. And you'll see people do this. And then I would ask, well, what's going on? Why aren't you pushing with your right hand? They said, yeah, we are. And I said, well, take your left hand down. Now push with your right hand. So, and then the conversation is why didn't it do that? Because we automatically pushed with our left hand. And that symbolizes how we're automatically wired to push back against things that happen. So it's a way of opening the door to that conversation. Then we're going to do the positivity exercise. This changes the bias of the initial stimulus appraisal. So think about it from a hunter-gatherer standpoint. They're out in the field, they're hunting, gathering, whatever, and they walk out into a field. It's natural to see how the first thing they would do is look for threats before they start looking for the food. They're going to make sure they scan for threats. So it makes sense that comes first. And even in priming, it's interesting that priming is all about sequence. So depending on like if you're filling out the heading for an exam, depending on what came first, if you activate gender first, there's one set of results you get. If you activate ethnicity first, depending on who the audience is, you get a different set of results because it's what activates first. And what's going on is the subconscious is activating for threat. And what we're going to do with the positivity conditioning is we're going to tone that down. We're going to reduce the amount of assumptions of threat from about 80% to something like 20% with this exercise. Threats are treated as life-threatening. We're going to, and so it doesn't really recognize, oh, that's just a kitten and this is a tiger. Everything is like a tiger, and it's all fight or flight. And we need to be focused and engaged. And most people have not encountered a tiger in the wild that could eat them in the last few years, but yet how many fight or flight episodes have you had? So just keep that in mind, changing the bias to neutral and positive. And we're not taking away your threat detection. We're just making sure that a threat is really a threat before we start finishing the processing, because this is happening so fast. It's happening inside of a quarter of a second. So you always have a chance to come back and reassess, but we're just saying we're going to skip some of these because then we already know there's not a threat using this process. And then it's retraining and takes time. So I need to impress upon you both of these, the emotional modulation less so, but still you have to practice it. And we just practiced it once. You can practice this over and over, and you can actually practice these two together, which you'll see in a moment. This one is definitely important to practice. It's going to take you about 6 weeks to fully own it on a bad day of a bad week. I would say to be able to execute it on a good day of a good week, you'll see results in as little as 10 days. But to own it, it's going to take you 4 to 6 weeks. So again, here's what we are. This is the same slide I showed you before, but we are in here. We are inside before the quarter of a second. This is happening here. And you cannot stop it when it's happening here, because by the time you know about it, an entire half second has entire quarter of a second has passed from this point to where the preconscious, the conscious mind or preconscious surfacing starts to happen. And that's why it takes time. The same way if you're training a dog to sit, you can get the dog to sit in a safe environment, but as soon as you get into something where there's a lot of stimulation, all of a sudden the dog doesn't want to sit. So you got to get back to a place of calm. But if you train it long enough, it'll sit in any kind of environment or whatever thing you're teaching them to do. So the positivity exercise, where we're going to start is you come up with an unpleasant experience. And I use the example of getting a flat tire. That equals the negative experience. And I use something minor like this. Again, you could be late for a meeting maybe, or maybe you lost some money or whatever. You had a little fender bender, anything that's an unpleasant experience. Maybe you had a bad experience at a meeting. So, but keep it calm, keep it mild, keep it something that it's just barely, nothing major, because we want to make sure we learn the steps. Then the next thing you're going to do is find the larger positive frame. So in the case of the flat tire, the larger positive frame or the larger positive context is the car. And probably, like most people, the car was once a goal. Now that you have the car, there are things that happen. You can't have a flat in your car if you don't have a car. So what we're going to do is make sure we can find the greater positive frame. Now, this is not positive thinking. It's not reframing. It's literally conditioning the network of neurons to scan your life and see, is there more positive context? So for example, if you lost money, the positive context that you have an income and that you had money to lose. As it may sound like positive mental attitude, if you had a bad experience at a meeting, the positive context is you have a job. The positive frame is you have a job. You don't want to intellectualize this. You want to make it literally a quick, and the closer, the more direct you can have it, the better. So that's why the flat in the car works really well. If you have a argument with a loved one, the positive context or positive frames that you have a great relationship with them. And the argument is just something that may happen. So that's, again, identify the larger positive frame. The car is the larger positive frame. So this is how you do it. And then having a car is the larger positive frame. The flat tire is the negative experience. And then here's the process. 3 times a day, and do 3 reps. Each rep is about 30 seconds. So I did it with meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner when I did this. But just do it. You want to do it every day, even on weekends. Just do it every day for 6 weeks, 3 times a day. Step 1, think of a bad experience. And every time you do it, you're going to think of a different one. First week, keep it all really light. Second week, you can go a little heavier. Third week, you can go a little heavier. Fourth week, you use stuff that's actually happening, real-time, current event type stuff. So step 1, think of a bad experience or uncomfortable experience. Quickly identify and switch to the larger positive frame. You want to do this fast because you're conditioning a subconscious network of neurons that processes very quickly. As soon as you think of getting that flat tire or being late for the meeting, immediately find the greater positive frame. Yeah, but I have a job. Yeah, but I have a car. And then let that bad experience fade. So you can see I have the tire fading into the car. Let that bad experience fade away and spend the next 20 seconds being grateful for the car. Then shake it off. do it again. The next time maybe you lost some money. Maybe you were at the casino and you should have stopped and you didn't, and then you lost another few $100s. Whatever. Yeah, but at least I had money to go to the casino, right? Immediately. And then let that fade off into the fact that you were out with friends hanging out, whatever it was. You can screenshot that. It's a specific form of gratitude. I don't want to confuse it with gratitude. I don't want to confuse it with reframing. I don't want to confuse it with positive mental attitude. This is not about insight. It's not about intellectualizing. It's about conditioning your unconscious, the network of neurons, at that first inside that quarter of a second. So while your network of neurons is looking at things like cognitive biases and finding the path of least resistance and meta programs and what you did before, it's also looking at, is there a larger positive frame for this thing? Because if there's a larger positive frame for this thing, it moves on to the next one. It's literally, you'll feel it. It skips it and it moves on to the next one. That's why I say by doing this, you'll actually experience fewer stimulus response cycles because they won't even hit. A lot of them just won't even rise to the level of your attention. And then the conditioning drill, just to repeat 3 times a day, for example, with meals, come up with 2 to 3 negative experiences from the past and immediately find the greater positive frame. Spend only a few seconds on the negative experience and fully immerse into the positive one. And lean into the pleasurable, greater feeling that you get from that. It's that gratitude, just appreciating the fact that you have a car, you have a job, you have the money, you were out with friends. And then you do this at least 5 days a week, but I prefer 6 or 7 every day, increasing the intensity of the negative experience that you use. Eventually you get to the point where you can actually process and start using it with the emotional modulation, because as the emotional modulation exercise comes up and you feel that negative thing, you can also take that one and look at the greater positive frame. So now you're processing old emotions. You're processing old emotions by not just saying, I'm not going to think about it, but saying, you know what? That emotion is connected to this. This emotion is connected to that. And it helps to process them and move them out of your neural pathways, and then they don't bother you anymore. And immediately begin looking for opportunities to apply the skill real time as you go about your day. That was a lot. And this is about prevention. It's huge because if you don't get a handle on that first half second, the reaction has a good chance of becoming your response. And if that happens, you run some risks. Like I like to say that trust is like you build trust like on an escalator going up, but you can lose it. It feels like jumping out a window on the way down. You can lose it in a day. You can lose it in a minute. Trust that was built up over years. Once you get a handle on that, you will start to spread out your step 2 in the 7-step process. You'll spend more time being regulated. And when you do some of the other things like understanding what is your cone of purpose and passion, which is where your choices lie, and you'll start ignoring some of that other stuff that doesn't matter. You'll be spending more time in circle of influence rather than circle of concern. And it's just this each step, each of this is part of the conditioning process. And the more you condition, the less you're going to experience focus, fight or flight, and you'll experience focus and engage. And you'll be able to get back to focus and engage quickly. And then you'll get to the point where you don't even notice the fight or flight. It just doesn't happen because focus and engage becomes a habit. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're out hiking and a mountain lion jumps up at you, that you'll still know what to do because it's a real threat. What we've done is taken away these false threats. And by doing that, you're going to have more energy, more capacity, more bandwidth to deal with the real threats, which is a good thing. All right, that is it. I'm going to be back, and I'll be on the other channels, Facebook and YouTube. And you can look at the 7stepreset.com/live to get those platforms. And next week, I'll start talking about what happens in the subsequent steps, the end of 3, and then 4, 5, 6, and 7. I don't spend a lot of time there because it's a little easier. It's more intellectual. We're not doing the conditioning, and it's more easily controlled, especially after you've taken care of the first 3 steps. All right, we'll see you next week.